At the end of May, George Floyd was murdered by a police officer. The country erupted in grief, anger, and outrage. Streets of Columbus filled with protesters sharing those emotions and demanding change in policing. We all saw images that fell far short of what we expected from some of our police officers as community during those weeks. And because of that, I set up a hotline to take complaints outside the police chain of command and to have them investigated independently. We referred 32 of these complaints to BakerHostetler to investigate for actions outside of division policy that then can be referred to the division for discipline or administrative action. More serious offenses, 21 to date, have been turned over to a former FBI agent who is now working to investigate for criminal charges. We have received some of the results from BakerHostetler. In a moment, you'll hear about why many cases were not sustained, which does not mean that the officers were exonerated, but simply that there was not enough evidence to prove or disprove the complaint. I can tell you, I was surprised and in many cases angered at the results. Like all of you, I saw the photos, I saw the videos, and I heard from friends, colleagues, and neighbors about what occurred on our streets those first days of protest. The results from these investigations proved to me more clearly than ever before the need for police reform. You will hear from BakerHostetler the challenges they faced in these investigations, including the unwillingness of some officers to share information and incomplete after-action reports by other officers, making it virtually impossible in some cases for BakerHostetler to identify the officers involved. And in some cases where police actions were deemed within policy, it became clear we needed to change the policy. Chief Quinlan and I had many discussions in the early days of the protests, and I directed him to make changes, including making it easier for officers to be identified and banning the use of tear gas to disperse crowds. He worked with officers to find ways to affix body-worn cameras to riot gear, and the use of riot gear was used less frequently after that first weekend. Some officers went above and beyond our policy to assure body cameras were attached to their body armor, and others made full and complete after-action reports. I commend them, but this should be the norm, not the exception, to build trust within our community. The need for a civilian review board with subpoena power and an inspector general office is more important now than ever before for fair, equitable, and transparent investigations into resident complaints, not done by CPD, not done by a law firm, but by our neighbors with professional, independent investigators. I would now like to turn the podium over to Jenny Edwards and Mark Hatcher from BakerHostetler. Jenny and Mark.
Thank you, Mayor. On behalf of BakerHostetler, I would like to thank the Mayor for entrusting us with these investigations. We took this responsibility very seriously, and we understand that we are but a small part in the change that the city endeavors to make in these investigations going forward. The scope of our administrative investigations was limited. BakerHostetler was asked to investigate citizen complaints against CPD of alleged excessive use of force during the recent protests. In so doing, we were tasked with answering the question, was the officer's use of force within or outside of CPD's policies or directives. In evaluating this, Baker was limited, and we were limited to the outcomes allowed under CPD's directives for investigation into sworn officer conduct. Those options, by virtue of CPD's policy, are limited to exonerated, which is the evidence indicates the alleged conduct occurred, but the actions taken by the employees were lawful and no misconduct was substantiated. Not sustained, which means the alleged conduct could not be supported or refuted by a preponderance of the evidence, or as the mayor more simply stated, we could not prove or disprove the complaint. Sustained, which is the alleged conduct is supported by a preponderance of the evidence and is in violation of the rules of conduct. Unfounded, the alleged conduct is refuted by a preponderance of the evidence. Or withdrawn, at which point a complainant would retract the allegations through either a verbal or written statement, and that is only available in certain limited circumstances. For those of you who are not as comfortable in the world of the preponderance of the evidence, let me define that as CPD's policy does. It's defined as the greater weight of the convincing evidence which outweighs or overbalances in one's mind the opposing evidence. Simply put, it's more likely than not that the conclusion that you reach occurred. Before I talk about the process that we underwent and the statistics of what we found, I'd like to highlight some of the places where we identified that change is necessary. And some of that change has already occurred. So keep in mind that most of our investigations to date relate to the last weekend in May and into the first half of June. We have not completed all of the investigations that would have come as of June 15th and beyond. June 15th is when the city changed its policy about using chemical spray against peaceful protesters. So all of the investigations that we've conducted to date and concluded to date were completed under the original policy. That's very important because what we concluded is that that policy change was absolutely necessary and valuable when we look at CPD's relationship with the community that it is sworn to protect and serve. Also, we identified, we had significant challenges, and we'll come back to this, but significant challenges in identifying officers involved in the conduct that was alleged. The city, throughout the course of June, made changes to policy that allowed us, as we got to some of these incidents even towards the middle of June, and certainly the investigations that we continue to conduct now, allowed us to more easily identify officers. So when we look at those not sustained findings, in nearly every one of those cases, it is because we were unable to identify the officers involved. So here are some of the challenges in identifying officers, again, some of which the city has already fixed. Number one, the riot gear consists of helmets with shields that cover the officer's hair and faces. When a gas mask is added, that allows for very little to no distinguishing features to be visible. The best identifier we would have in those cases was body type and size. While this was useful actually in a couple situations for folks who were officers who were outside the norm in some variation, it was not useful in most cases because most officers fall within a similar height and build. Number two, the riot gear covers the officer badge numbers and names. There was no way for a citizen who is interacting with an officer who's wearing riot gear to be able to identify that officer by sight or to provide us with specific individualized characteristics that we could use to identify the officer. What that also means is any videos or photos that were taken, even if the video or photo was clear and close up, would not allow us to identify the officer who was under all of that riot gear. So when we can't see badge numbers, we can't see faces, sometimes we can't see hair color, and we can't see names, it makes it rather difficult to determine who is under all of that gear. Number three, when officers were wearing their riot gear, most were not, at the beginning of the protests, able to affix their body-worn cameras to that gear while also being able to use the gear to the full extent of the safety that it might provide. CPD's SWAT officers were never issued body-worn cameras. They never had been at that time. Our best opportunity for identifying officers where we can't see a badge and we couldn't see a name would be to use their own body-worn cameras or the body-worn cameras of officers who were near them. If, however, we have officers who are unable to wear their body-worn cameras and their fellow officers nearby were also unable to wear their body-worn cameras, that makes it significantly more difficult yet again. When there are no cameras from the officers, there's no video. The best video that we received when we were attempting to identify officers was through the body-worn cameras. They were an incredible tool to us because compared to an iPhone, they are providing a much clearer quality picture. They are generally up close to those around them, and it makes it much, much easier. So when we look at the officers who were unable to attach, that created great concerns. Particularly as well when we look at the SWAT officers. They're obviously the most likely to be engaged in the most dangerous and volatile situations. They're the best trained and the most accustomed to using force. Thus, when the allegations are the most serious, the most likely to have resulted in a specific injury to a protester, they were also the most likely not to have been wearing a body-worn camera. This caused a serious obstacle to identifying the officers who used non-lethal munitions, like multiple baton rounds, which are also commonly referred to as knee knockers. The lack of body-worn camera on SWAT officers, along with their riot gear, compounded the difficulty in identifying the officers involved because CPD's officers were also working directly with officers from other agencies who were also engaging in uses of force. The citizens who were being subjected to that force understandably could not distinguish between the agencies, nor determine which agency's officer fired the baton round that injured him or her. So again, when it mattered most, there were also the most obstacles to identifying the officers involved. For our team, this was both frustrating and concerning, and we were happy to see as we continued to engage in these investigations that the policies around many of these identification obstacles were changed. And where we saw that and where it became easier throughout the time was when we saw these particular things implemented, and we would recommend that they continue to be implemented. The riot gear can have a strip of tape that is affixed to it. That tape can have the officer's badge number and or name on it. That makes it significantly easier both for the individuals who are interacting with that officer as well as for investigators who are later looking into conduct to determine who was involved. And there were some officers in our investigations who had written their names or badge numbers on a piece of masking tape on their helmets or chest plates for their riot gear, and protesters were easily able to identify them. We were able to identify them, and it was an easy solution, and we hope that it becomes the norm. Another exception, some officers went to great lengths to ensure that they were in fact wearing their body-worn camera, as the mayor stated. And that made a significant difference in our ability to determine the facts in several of our investigations. They did this either by placing the the camera between the riot gear and their gun belts, or because they chose at risk to their own safety to wear their riot gear incorrectly to ensure that their cameras were there and able to be used. This should not be a choice that the officers are allowed or required to make. All officers should be equipped with body-worn cameras that can be worn with their riot gear and should be required to wear them to enable future investigators to be in a better position to identify them. We also faced some additional obstacles in identifying officers. At least over the first weekend of the protests, the officers were not always working with their own units and squads. They were standing on skirmish lines with officers on either side of them whom they did not know. And when responding to officer and trouble calls, they were jumping into the closest vehicle with that officer's safety in mind and jumping into that vehicle with other officers who might have just happened to be nearby. In short, there were several circumstances where CPD has no record of where individual officers were, and the individual officers have no idea who was in the car with them or standing beside them. This was not only an obstacle to identifying all of the officers involved in a particular incident, but it was also a safety issue for the officers. If their supervisors do not know where they went or who they went there with, their supervisors also would not know if something bad had happened to them. As the mayor mentioned, officers are required after a use of force to submit a use of force report. For example, the example that was repeatedly given to us was if an officer were to respond to a bar fight and used force to break up that fight, they knew that they have to call their supervisor and inform the supervisor of that use of force and submit a use of force report. However, many officers, particularly over the first weekend of protests in May, did not submit use of force reports after engaging in force against protesters. This means two things. First, back to our original point, it contributed to the difficulty of identifying officers whom citizens recorded and had videotapes of engaging in force. When combined again with their riot gear and the lack of body-worn cameras, the officers' failure to submit paperwork meant there was one less tool available for identifying who engaged in the use of force, and thus created the inability to determine what happened before, during, or after a recorded use of force that might have been submitted by a citizen. Second, it meant that many of the officers who were interviewed were specifically identified because they did complete the paperwork that was required of them. In short, those officers who did what was required of them were more often identified and interviewed by us, and those who did not do that avoided both identification and investigation. And that's a problem that we hope the city will resolve. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that our team also experienced disappointment at some officers whose memory might have seemed strong throughout an interview and then seemed to experience difficulty in remembering things at the time that they were asked to identify the officers who were around them. This was not true of the overwhelming majority of the officers we interviewed, but it did occur, and it was exceptionally frustrating. Without independent means of identifying officers, there are many cases that we were forced to conclude were not sustained because we could not identify the officer who engaged in the alleged conduct. With that, I'd like to turn back to our process and some of our conclusions. BakerHostetler had a team of 10 lawyers responsible for these investigations. To date, our team has contacted over 95 citizens, either because they submitted a complaint or were identified as a witness to an incident we are investigating. Of those 95 citizens, again to date, 35 were willing to be interviewed by our investigators and shared information beyond what they had originally submitted. We would like to extend our thanks to those citizens for being willing to spend time with us, to explain to us what for many of them was a very traumatic event, and to help us come to a conclusion in their cases. We've reviewed hundreds of hours of videos, including the videos taken on individual smartphones by citizens on the street, videos that concern citizens found on social media and submitted, city crime camera footage, cruiser video footage, and body-worn camera footage. We have listened to hours of officer radio traffic, reviewed hundreds of use of force reports, after-action reports, and EOC communications. To date, we have also conducted over 90 officer interviews. Every officer who was interviewed was ordered by the chain of command to answer the questions we posed and to answer them truthfully. The complaints that we investigated came either through citizen complaints to the Internal Affairs Bureau, which is the normal process for submitting a complaint related to officer conduct, or through the mayor's report CPD email address. The cases that contain the most serious allegations, to reiterate a point that the mayor made, of officer use of force are not currently being investigated by BakerHostetler. Those were submitted for criminal investigation. If he makes a determination the officer conduct in those cases was not criminal, BakerHostetler may be asked to conduct an administrative investigation going forward. Of the complaints that were referred to us, we had two tasks. For some, we were asked to make an initial determination about whether the use or whether the issue the citizen raised rose to the level of a potential use of force and therefore should be investigated. For other complaints, the city had already made the determination that something should be fully investigated and therefore specifically tasked us with investigating those complaints fully. This will explain to some degree why there are some of the written reports that we've submitted that are very short, maybe 2 or 3 pages, as compared to others that we submitted that are dozens or more pages long. A lot of that is by virtue of the task that was given to us with a particular complaint. To date, we have submitted over 30 reports to the CPD chain of command, and of those, I mentioned that. Of those, we have submitted reports resolving 41 allegations of use of force. We currently have 13 open cases. 9 of those have deadlines for completion that have not yet passed. 4 of them are beyond the 90-day timeline. I'd like to take this opportunity to talk about some of the limitations that exist in these investigations by virtue of the contract with the FOP. The collective bargaining agreement with the Fraternal Order of Police, Lodge 9, creates obstacles to completing thorough investigations into allegations of officer misconduct. One of those obstacles is that it sets an arbitrary deadline of 90 days for the completion of an investigation into a citizen complaint. To exceed the 90 days, the FOP must agree and is obligated not to withhold its agreement unreasonably. In this situation, where the city faced an unprecedented number of citizen complaints related to officer conduct over a very short period of time, the FOP categorically denied any and all requests to extend the deadlines in all cases, no matter what the reasons for the request. The FOP's decision to withhold its agreement to extend the deadlines in the cases for which we've requested them was absolutely unreasonable. There are additional challenges within the FOP contract to conducting a full and fair, complete investigation of a citizen complaint. In addition to the 90-day timeline, an officer is entitled, both by virtue of public records law, but also by virtue of the collective bargaining agreement, to receive a recorded copy of every interview that has taken place in that case prior to that officer's interview. So if we interviewed a complainant, a citizen who brought forward a valid complaint, the officer would have the opportunity to listen to that entire recording before sitting down with us. They also have the opportunity to listen to the recording of any individual officer's interview whose may have occurred before theirs. They have the opportunity to, and we are required to produce in advance every document that we looked at, every video that we reviewed, every radio traffic recording that we listened to has to be produced to the officer prior to his or her interview. I know that that's not the sort of, I don't expect that that is the right I would have if I were interviewed related to my own misconduct, but the FOP's contract guarantees that right to the individual officers who are alleged to have engaged in misconduct. Similarly, an officer has the right prior to entering a room for an interview to know whether he or she is being identified as the focus of the investigation, whether we are specifically interviewing that individual because of allegations against him or her, or allegations that he or she engaged in misconduct, or whether they are being identified as a witness to someone else's misconduct. If we've identified someone as a witness prior to the officers entering the room, the officer has the right, if during that interview we determine, hey, you might now actually be a focus of an investigation, the officer has the right to have us stop that investigation, at which point he or she would be entitled to the entire file that we had already reviewed, and that she or she would be entitled to take time to consult with a representative before continuing that interview. Finally, when we look at the FOP contract and where it can be a challenge, the officers are entitled to a written summary of the allegations against them if they're the focus officer. So before they come into the room, we have to have sufficient facts to be able to identify for them what it is we'll be talking to them about and what the allegations are. We were not allowed to ask questions outside the scope of those allegations. So in a situation like this, where we have days and days and days of interaction between citizens and officers, we were only allowed to ask questions about the very specific allegation that brought that officer into the room with us. This made it very difficult, particularly in this circumstance, to figure out what happened before, during, and after the event that the citizen has brought to our attention. We know that FOP contracts and police contracts can create problems and are creating problems for divisions across the country. And we would highlight for you that we believe going forward there are opportunities to improve the contractual obligations the City of Columbus has with the FOP. As I mentioned, at this point, we're still investigating 13 complaints. To date, we have concluded, I think now we're up to 36 investigations. In those, we have recommended the following conclusions. We have exonerated the conduct of 4 officers. We have sustained the allegations against 1 officer. We've concluded that there are 9 unfounded complaints. There are 2 complaints that were withdrawn maybe a little less formally than required, and therefore we concluded that those were unfounded as well. And we were unable to sustain the allegations, so again, to prove as true or not true 25 of the allegations. At this point, I think I would like to conclude my prepared remarks related to the investigations. We would, however, like to highlight two things. One, we believe that there are opportunities that by virtue of our having engaged in this investigative process and of having these investigations take place outside of the Internal Affairs Bureau, we have provided significant value and have great insight that we look forward to providing to the city, some of which we've already provided, but also to former U.S. District Attorney Carter Stewart as he engages in his analysis of the overall picture of how the city handled the protests and opportunities for improvement. We look forward to contributing the knowledge that we've gained over the last 60 or so days to that process. We look forward to sharing opportunities for future investigations and how they might be conducted differently than the IAB has conducted them in the past, including providing greater opportunity for citizens to share their stories, providing greater opportunity for objectivity, and providing better written product that will allow the citizens who raise those complaints, as well as the rest of us, to understand what happened in that particular circumstance. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Ned Pettis, Jr., Director of Public Safety for the City of Columbus, and I want to thank BakerHostetler for their meticulous work on these investigations. I also want to thank my team in public safety for their tireless efforts to review the flood of emails we received through the Report CPD email account, more than 1,000 in all. Our staff referred 32 separate complaints and/or incidents to BakerHostetler for investigation. Some of those had multiple complainants, multiple allegations, or multiple subject officers in them. These ranged from complaints on specific use of force events to general complaints about use of force, complaints about elected officials, complaints about police leadership, compliments for the Division of Police, complaints about arrests and jail conditions, and other complaints unrelated to the protests. The existing process of taking citizen complaints was simply not equipped to handle this extraordinary volume. Mayor Ginther set up a system through which more citizens could be heard by lodging complaints and having them investigated. One of my takeaways from the BakerHostetler finding is the need for a civilian review board, which is on the ballot for voters to decide this November. I feel strongly that if approved by voters, the Civilian Review Board and Inspector General need to be independent of some of the requirements and deadlines that currently exist in our contract with the FOP. It does not serve the greatest public value to have a drop-dead 90-day timeline for an investigation. That is not how we get to greater accountability and greater public trust. What we've heard loud and clear from the community is we have to do better. We have to take a hard look at ourselves and how we do the work of public safety to build trust with the community that we serve. We also learned through this process that there were improvements that need to be made to increase transparency and ensure accountability. Now, based on these findings, the vast majority of these cases will not come before me. Discipline will be decided by the chain of command without coming to my office. But where I do have a very active role is coordinating with the chief to identify areas that require improvement and policies that need to be changed, including issues that need to be negotiated in future contracts. It is my role and my commitment to oversee the chief in his implementation of the changes and reforms identified in the BakerHostetler investigation. And now I want to invite Chief Quinlan up to talk more about what he's already doing to make that happen. Chief.
Thank you, Director and Mayor. The evening of May 28th began an extraordinary level of public protest and First Amendment activities in our city that lasted for the weeks that followed. All members of the Division of Police value the rights of all people, and we are committed to protecting the expression of constitutionally protected activities. There were clear incidents that occurred in our city that went beyond peaceful protests, and in fact, placed many people in harm's way, which resulted in numerous injuries and unsettling levels of property destruction. There were many people present who found themselves in danger from injuries from the actions of some who chose riots over protest, and everyone present was at risk of the real peril of a global pandemic. Regardless, it is the right of people to question how police perform our duties and expect an investigation and accountability. I'm very proud of Columbus police officers today for two very specific reasons. One, officers reported to duty despite known risk these protests created for them and their families. Since March 14th, we had in place a robust exposure mitigation plan that was designed to protect officers from the deadly COVID virus to the extent possible, considering the inherent risk in the nature of police work. Those safeguards were unavoidably interrupted, and on May 28th, and all personnel of the division, sworn in civilian, reported for duty and did everything within their control to maintain order and safety in our community. Secondly, I am proud that officers who were directly engaging with protesters, that included people who made overt criminal acts of harm to these officers and did injure over 200 officers, some who remain off work today and have had surgeries and undergoing rehabilitation. But still, these officers answered the call to duty. We owe officers our thanks for the work they did keeping people safe. That does not mean people do not have a right to question the policies and training officers followed or the manner in which they carried out their duties. We are certainly willing to look at any allegation when an officer is accused of misconduct. In this case, it was the decision of the city to assign citizen complaints of misconduct to an outside professional law firm who conducted the investigations. I fully support the city's decision. I'm appreciative of BakerHostetler's professionalism, diligence, and thoroughness in these investigations. While I'm proud of the work our personnel did under these protest activities, any situation where we fell short of our community's expectations is disappointing. Where my officers fell short, or where we fell short as a division, I accept all criticism. I reaffirm my obligation to make necessary reforms to policies and procedures to rebuild trust within our community. I want to assure the community that lessons learned from the investigation by Baker, along with other companion investigations, will not be ignored. Changes and reforms that are underway since the protests were handled. I have ordered our SWAT personnel and others who participate in tactical operations to be equipped with and utilize body-worn cameras. I ordered a specially trained team to be developed to exclusively handle police response to protests and particularly First Amendment activities in our city. We have new legislation that places stricter compliance standards on executing search warrants, particularly related to no-knock warrants, which will now require my permission prior to seeking a judge's approval. The creation of a new Chiefs Advisory Panel. I requested the mayor and city council each select community leaders to serve on an advisory panel who will help generate policy and training plans for the division into the future, as well as critique critical incidents. 14 members of our community have graciously accepted this task. We have had 2 meetings to date, August 11th and September 8th, and our 3rd meeting is scheduled for October 5th. Our last meeting focused on our new agreement with the Ohio Attorney General Office to investigate officer-involved critical incidents such as shootings. We discussed plans on collecting and publicly reporting incidents of officers who aim firearms at individuals to control their movements. And we discussed force continuums currently in use and changes that might be sought. Policies have been updated as well. To give a few examples, I've instituted a new system ensuring officers who are working in crowd control protective gear have highly visible identification on the front and back of their outermost garments, as well as methods of mounting body cameras to this equipment. I've given new directions for the use of chemical irritants that will require greater restraint, authorization to deploy, new methods of deploying, and strengthening reporting protocols. While investigations conducted by a civilian law firm mostly concluded officers operated within the scope of existing policy, I am taking actions to revise policies that did not serve us or the public well, and focusing on new training strategies to ensure police response to future encounters is more reflective of community expectations. Thank you for your time, and I'd like to invite Mayor Ginther back.
Thank you, Chief, Director Pettis, Jenny, and Mark. Appreciate your comprehensive and diligent work on these investigations. I do want to reiterate that the investigations for the more egregious complaints that could lead to criminal charges are ongoing. Those complaints are not deemed criminal. They will be then turned over to BakerHostetler for administrative investigation. I also want to reiterate that although most of the findings were not sustained, does not exonerate the officers. The actions we witnessed in many cases were unacceptable, did not live up to my expectations and those of the community. These investigations are not the end of our commitment to police reform. They will become part, as Jenny mentioned, of the Carter Stewart high-level report on how the city as a whole responded to protests. As the chief just mentioned, he now meets regularly with the chief's advisory panel that was seated in July to continue to discuss policies and procedures at CPD. And I will continue to stress the need for police reform, revisions to the FOP contract, and a civilian review board, an inspector general role with subpoena power. These investigations, the challenges that Mark and Jenny and their colleagues found, all of the things discovered through this investigation, I think are a glaring example. The time for action and reform is now. And that power is in the hands of the people of Columbus. Be happy to take a few questions. Yes?
You talked about this investigation that's been going on now and the struggles with the timeline. That was something, the 90-day drop-dead deadline. But the city requested that the police department halt all IAB investigations while that timeline was ongoing to employ the law firm, delaying that. And this was for a deadline that was in a contract that you signed off on 3 years ago as mayor. You know, what does that say if your actions and the actions that your office has taken have contributed to this issue?
We believe that the police cannot investigate themselves. We believe that independent investigations help to build community trust and confidence, help with accountability, transparency, and oversight. And that's why we're pursuing this issue on the November ballot for a civilian review board and the role of inspector general. And we will negotiate that as our top priority with the FOP in December.
But it's never been an issue before now.
We have never had what we faced and what Jenny and Mark outlined. We've never faced that as a city before either. Yes.
What discipline will officers face for failing to file the after-action reports?
Probably a better question for the director. Chief, you want to take that?
Thank you. Again, what our policy is to, you get a use of force, just go through an example. You use force, you put someone in handcuffs, put them back in the car, you call your sergeant, the sergeant comes out, takes photographs, interviews the person, talks to the officer, talks to witnesses, gathers all the evidence and the documents. That's how things typically run. As Jenny pointed out, this was an unprecedented level of incidents going on over a period of a month, 16, 17 hours days, 6, 7 days a week. And so the process, and this is against a policy, it's not the fault of the officers. This is going to be on my shoulders to address this as policy. How can we make sure that officers that are using force at Broad and High and then State and High and Town and High and Mountain High and then back up to Long and High, going back and forth along with where these protests are occurring and violence is erupting, how do we make a system where officers can report that accurately? Once we're able to equip officers properly with body cameras, one system would be to narrate, simply narrate what you did, where and when, what you did. So that way, because you may not even have the person in custody, you may have used force, they may have fled if it's just a dispersal agent, and you may not have them, so you don't have anyone there to interview. So the idea is there's ways to fix this going forward. What discipline will they face currently? Again, if they're identified as someone that did not provide the proper report to a supervisor, then they can face anything from what's called positive corrective action or counseling, retraining, or a reprimand. But in this case, it wouldn't be anything more than a reprimand because the policy in this case failed them.
Will you be pursuing that?
If we have information from the investigation that provided, again, if someone did not report and we don't have any information on who the individual is, we don't have anyone to discipline. If it comes to our attention with individuals, that will be investigated separately.
Right. Do you see how that's a problem in terms of incentives? If the officer basically fails to do their job, they avoid any accountability? You definitely want to shift those incentives, correct?
Well, what I can tell you is in past cases where officers have neglected to report use of force have resulted in substantial discipline. We take it very seriously. As I pointed out, and Baker had pointed out many times, this incident, the magnitude of this incident has never been anticipated by anyone negotiating a collective bargaining agreement or someone writing policy. We simply have never seen where there's over 900 officers out in the city of Columbus, all engaged in interactions with the public, with this level of sustained damage and looting going on in the city, and be able to stop what they're doing, call a sergeant over, and report that use of force at that time. And 4 or 5 hours later, they may not even remember where all they used force at, because there was so much occurring so fast. What burden we placed on officers in this situation was unprecedented. And that's why I say I'm proud of the fact that they showed up to work and they still stood that line and did what they could to keep people safe.
Chief, I think the next point, you have recommended termination for officers in the past for being untruthful.
Yes.
Could someone view that through the prism of they omitted the truth in this case? I mean, you see what I'm saying?
We have looked at omissions as critical misconduct in the past. Again, every investigation, most of these investigations are actually driven by federal case law, or a Loudermill case and a Weingarten and Enterprise Wire case. So those all limit how we handle these cases. So with that in mind, we can look at those if we find somebody intentionally omitted something for the purpose of concealing it, as opposed to just being involved in mass chaos and just doesn't remember what all they did, where they did. There is a difference.
Yes, go ahead. And I guess one point to reinforce, that's part of what the Chief's advisory panel is working on with the Chief right now. Obviously we're looking at, the first thing they're looking at is how we engaged around these protests and a number of other things, making sure that the policies and procedures that are under the Chief's purview are meeting and exceeding the community's expectations. And so that's something, obviously, in addition to case law input from the community about changes to policy and procedures taking place with that panel. Luann, I'm sorry.
I understand that you approved a $500,000 contract with BakerHostetler. Can you tell us how much of that money has been spent to this date? What's the price tag on this investigation to this point? I understand it's ongoing. And can you tell us, with Columbus being $41 million in the hole with the pandemic, talk about whether this investigation, was it worth it, especially with one officer complaint sustained?
Well, a couple of things. I think the total for the contract is actually $550,000. I'll make sure that the staff follow up with that detail. I think that's the number. Let me tell you this. We're the 14th largest city in America. I don't think there's anything more important than the relationship between the Division of Police and the public. Transparency, oversight, accountability. We give our officers a great deal of power. You and I cannot stop. We cannot detain people. We cannot question them. We cannot arrest them. We can't take away their freedom or their property, and ultimately cannot use of force the way our officers are empowered to do. That's an incredible power and an incredible responsibility that comes with the community's trust. And I believe in a city this size, with a division this size, with the resources we invest in the Division of Police, that this investigation has taught us a great deal, has held officers accountable. I think it's important to remember, Luann, that 24 of these also were not sustained. So the alleged conduct could not be supported or refuted by a preponderance of the evidence. So there is one sustained case, but there are 24 of them that could not be disproved. And we also learned a lot about why our policies needed to change, because many of the incidents that Baker investigated would be outside of policy today, but were not at the time they took place. And so the chief has a role to play in that, the director has a role to play in that, I have a role to play in that, and the community has a role to play in that. So I believe that it's worth investing in transparency, accountability, and oversight. And I believe the people of Columbus support police reform, change, and independent investigations.
How much has been spent to this point, sir?
I'll leave that to Director or Chief. I think it's a $550,000 total, is that correct? But we'll get you the exact number where it's at this point.
Sir, in terms of the upcoming contract, you have repeatedly talked about the Citizen Review Board, but in terms of investigating officer complaints, I'm frankly floored by what she said about, the amount of evidence that officers get before walking into the room. Is that something that you want to reassess as well?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think clearly what this has, and this is an important community conversation because oftentimes the public hasn't been at the bargaining table. And what folks need to understand is what is in this contract that has to change. And this didn't happen overnight. This is decades and decades of a contract that's out of whack with our community's values. And they're out of whack, quite honestly, with communities' values around the country. And so for police reform, oversight, and accountability to take place, that contract has to change. And we need the people of Columbus to be directly involved in the reform and change we need to make. Yes, Lacey?
Mayor, you signed off on the FOP contract that you're talking about right now. You also signed on BakerHostetler originally to no more than a $50,000 contract. It was increased to $550,000, again, a no-bid contract, because you knew there was a 90-day deadline. So what in all of that would you have changed since your argument against the FOP contract when you agreed to the FOP contract a few years ago?
Well, clearly, the FOP contract has to change. And I think what has become very clear to me and the community is it has to change faster. We've negotiated in the last couple of contracts, certainly the last round, expanding that deadline, giving more time for investigations to be completed, some other changes that the chief and I wanted to see made. But quite honestly, there are so many things that we've talked about here today that have to change in that contract. And so I'm committed to this and know that it's not going to happen all at once, that we're going to have to stay committed to this. We didn't get here overnight. We're not going to fix this overnight. But I'm going to move with a sense of urgency and passion to make sure that this change and reform takes place.
So was this worth the amount of taxpayer money?
Absolutely. I believe that oversight, accountability, and transparency, independent investigations are critically important to help restore trust and confidence of the people of Columbus in the Division of Police. And I believe that engaging in this larger conversation about police reform and changing the FOP contract, putting a civilian review board in place, an inspector general with subpoena power, are all critical steps on this journey. Yes?
Mayor, how will you work with the FOP to bring about these changes that certainly they're going to have some thoughts on and they're going to weigh in on? And also, this may be a question for the chief, but the one officer whose situation was sustained, what sort of discipline is that officer facing, and has that been handed down to the
I'll let the chief or the director handle that. I'm going to work with them, but the people of Columbus get to speak first. And this is the first time ever the people of Columbus have been able to directly be involved in police reform with their vote in November. And so, want to encourage the community. If you're as frustrated as I am, request that absentee ballot today. Get involved. Make sure your voice is heard. And allow us to go to the table in December to negotiate in good faith, strong, meaningful reform with the FOP. Chief?
So regarding the potential discipline, as I understand the investigation, I signed stuff at that level, at a deputy chief level, to sign off on, unless it's going to rise to departmental charges, where I would hold a hearing and send it to the director. So my understanding of the case is, and the one that's sustained, is it was not a finding of excessive force. That would have gone to the director, because I would have sustained that and sent it over for suspension. This was a case where, as I understand, it was a fail to report a push and a mace. Apparently pushed a person, an individual, they fell to the ground and deployed mace. This person also, this officer also had multiple reported uses of force along that same timeline. And one question, as I understand it, the officer does not recall, even after seeing the video, said, I don't even recall that happening. It's right there, I can't deny it, I just don't remember, that's why I didn't report that one. But I did report all these because, again, so much was going on, it was so chaotic. Whether the officer did remember and fail to report, when he did report others, it is entirely likely in that situation, so much was going on so fast, he did not recall that particular one when he went back at the end of the night 12 hours later and tried to piece all these together. And so because of that, he would be facing probably what's called a minor reprimand or a written reprimand.
So what does that entail? Just essentially a write-up?
A write-up, which stays in your file for 3 years.
Chief, one of the overarching, this is maybe a question for you and for the mayor, one of the overarching themes, what I'm hearing today is obviously a need for police reform. That's the desire of the mayor's. Can you give us an update on your working relationship with the mayor? Because publicly, you guys have appeared to be in lockstep, but privately, there were emails from yourself and from deputy chiefs expressing frustration over what was happening in the days after these protests.
Well, you know, I bring my own life experience and my years of professional experience to this position. The mayor has his life experience and his professional experience to bring. I don't think anyone expects us to be clones or be carbon copies. We each have our own independent ideas and thoughts. I give him my views, he gives me his views. We know that with that situation that, you know, I give a lot of deference to the mayor's views. He's the boss. So we don't have to be in unison and in exact lockstep, because there's value in having the diversity, the different ideas and opposing thoughts, and talking these things out and coming to a better resolution with the knowledge we both bring to the table and find the best solution and outcome. So I think that relationship is very complementary, because we do have different viewpoints on the issues of the day and can both speak freely to each other about what we might need to do to resolve that. And I think that works very well for us.
Do you still hold on to any frustration about some of the reforms that are going forward?
I think I made it clear when I took this job that my views were to reform the Division of Police. In fact, back in April, I have a record, I put out 127 reform items that I was planning. Most of these things, like body cameras on SWAT officers and stopping no-knock warrants, all those things were already on my radar and my reform list back in April. But there were so many, this has actually helped me prioritize which ones I need to move to the top and get done now.
So what I didn't hear, Chief, was whether or not you're still harboring any frustration over how these changes are happening.
No, what I said was I'm committed to reform. That's what I came to this job to do, is reform. So I think there's frustration in reforming the process, but the ideology of making change and coming up with new solutions is something I embrace.
Chief, maybe this is a question for both of you. In reviewing all of these, the videos, the audio recordings, all of the documentation that's been provided to you, are there going to be any charges placed or things sent to Zach Klein's office or maybe Ron O'Brien's office regarding actions of protesters that may result in criminal activity, such as looting, rioting, breaking into businesses, assaulting officers or other people?
Yeah, I'd probably have to defer to the city attorney on that, but clearly we want to make sure we made clear from Jump Street that we support peaceful protests and we support people exercising their constitutional rights to bring their rage, fear, concern, passion for reform to the streets, and to do so peacefully. But those who break the law will be held accountable. And so, I'd have to defer to the city attorney and to the chief on exact cases or incidents. But yes, any resources that we have, whether it's our officers and people power or evidence that we have, we're going to hold folks accountable for breaking the law, and we're going to hold our officers accountable when they violate our policies, procedures, or as the former FBI agent, retired FBI agent, is examining criminal activity. We're going to hold people accountable. Chief, do you have any additional comments or director on that?
Thank you, Mayor. I'll just say that we do have open investigations going on into the activities of people who are committing violent crimes, breaking into buildings, looting. Most of those are evidence that we came across on our own, not something submitted through this investigative process. I did, and Jenny will probably know which one I'm talking about. I did just read a case last night where an individual accused us of dropping canisters of pepper spray and gas from the helicopter. Well, I can tell you that would never, ever happen, because if that would go off in the helicopter, you know what would happen. So, but in that case, they also said the videos they provided didn't actually show what they were accusing the officer of doing, but did show people inside businesses along High Street rioting and looting. So whether those ultimately become something that we look at to try to identify, that's something we'll have to look at later, because that's evidence we did not have previously. But we do have other evidence that we are currently looking at and pursuing charges on.
WBNS had to hire an attorney to get these records. It looks like the first investigation was complete on August 25th. Why were the records withheld?
I'll defer to the safety director on that, since he was kind of pointing his office on that. Director.
Sure. The investigations were led, the entire process, by Assistant Safety Director Kathleen Burke. And when she would receive a completed investigation, she would forward them to the Division of Police, their Public Records Department, and the chain of command would be responsible for reviewing them. The process involved getting a complete package before they were deemed to be released. And that was the process that was in place. So when we sent them from our office to the Division of Police, it was with the instructions to hold them until the entire package had been received.
But they should have been considered individual public records, each one. The first one was completed August 25th. That was, how many days ago? Why weren't they released individually as they were ready?
I can't answer that question because packages were sent to us and then sent to the Division of Police. I could speculate that maybe a request wasn't specific enough. Maybe you didn't have enough information for a specific report. I believe Jenny identified the number of different reports. I didn't even look at those specific ones because they go through the chain of command to the chief, and if the chief determines that they come back to me, is the first time that I take a look at them. So from my perspective, you would have to identify a specific record for me to tell the chief to release that specific record.
Any other questions? Luann.
The not sustained allegations, is there evidence of misconduct? What I'm hoping to understand is, the implication from what you're saying and what the representative from the law firm was saying is that there was some sort of misconduct. What can you say about that? And what can you say about, as you look at the vast majority of what went on in these protests, from the police contact point of view, there were some officers who were out there doing what they could to work on keeping law and order out there. It was a difficult time. So talk a little bit about those not sustained and about the bulk of the officers who presumably were doing what their contract tells them to do. They were operating within their contract and policy.
Yeah, I think clearly, overwhelmingly, what we saw in those days is the overwhelming majority of our officers did an incredible job. We support the Division of Police. We support our officers. We can support them and demand change and reform at the same time. This is not an either-or proposition. And we also believe that we have to bring a sense of urgency to oversight, accountability, and transparency. And that's why we're pursuing all the changes and reforms that we're pursuing. I'll let Jenny and Mark maybe speak to, if you're looking, if there were violations of policy, if the issue was that it wasn't sustained because we couldn't identify the officer involved, or if it wasn't sustained because of another reason. But Mark, Jenny, would you like to take that?
And Mark, one Additional question, don't the officers on their riot helmet have their number on the helmets?
There are instances where officers did have identifying badge numbers on their helmets, and where we were able to review, where the video was clear enough that we were able to identify officers. I think in up to 3, we were able to identify officers in that regard. But with respect to some of those non-sustained cases, it oftentimes was the result of us not being able to identify an officer. So there were potential violations of the use of force policy, but because we could not identify the officers involved, we were unable to say, that we weren't unable to determine that those instances were sustained.
Internal Affairs had done these investigations. Do you think they would have been able to get to the bottom of it?
I don't believe so, because and for the simple fact that, and it's important to understand that in the course of these investigations, we worked with Internal Affairs, and they participated in all of our interviews. And so I believe, in my opinion, that we went above and beyond what would probably transpire in a normal situation. One, because we had the manpower, the people power to get that done, but also because, again, we were given a really specific directive from the mayor and the public safety director to get to the bottom of this and to investigate these allegations fully.
Can I just get a quick follow-up on that? Sure. You mentioned, I want to put kind of a fine point on this, that in many of these not sustained cases, what you saw was what would be a violation, but the problem was you couldn't identify who was the individual doing it. Can you give us a number for which is which?
Yeah,
No,
we don't have that level of detail.
But we can
We can definitely follow up.
Before you leave, Mark, I do want to ask. So I talked with somebody this morning, and they said, okay, I know you're frustrated and disappointed with the findings, but tell me, how would a civilian review board and inspector general with subpoena power have impacted these investigations? And so I want to ask Mark to speak to that. If he and his team would have had subpoena power, to help with these independent investigations, how it would have impacted it from a community trust standpoint. Mark?
That's a fantastic question, Mr. Mayor. I think, Jenny really did a fantastic job articulating the challenges that we faced in conducting this investigation. Time was not on our side, but nevertheless, we still had to move forward. And with that being said, I do want to commend the chief and officers from Columbus Police Department, because they, with no exception, everyone we require or we requested to appear for an interview did so. However, as Jenny indicated, there are aspects of the process that, I guess what I would consider shift the burden, if you will, or don't necessarily allow for a level playing field for fully and completely investigating all aspects of an allegation of excessive force. So, with that being the case, a civilian review board, in particular, an inspector general, would have pretty broad authority and power to investigate these allegations completely, would not have the limitations of time that we faced, but also eliminating some of the administrative challenges that we faced would present an opportunity to truly get to the bottom of these investigations. And so, as we evaluate and look at the conclusions that we've reached, I think that it very clearly speaks to the need for policy change, for policy reform, in many aspects, from the FOP contract perspective, but also from the perspective of the policies that exist within CPD. And I think it should be very encouraging to hear that many of those policy changes have occurred. There are institutions being put in place, and the legislation that the mayor has spoken about here today is going to give the power to the people of Columbus to determine whether or not this process will move forward with the Civilian Review Commission.
We have time for one more question. Lacey, you got your hand up first. Is it for Mark or
I have
or
a question for the chief.
Chief?
Chief, the mayor said he was surprised and at times angered at the results. Given the amount of encounters your officers had with protesters over several weeks, how do you feel about the findings that there was one sustained allegation against your officers?
Well, I have to preface it by saying not all investigations are counted yet. There's still criminal investigations that are going on. So as far as anything that's still pending, I'll withhold any judgment. On things that have been concluded, again, as I said, I'm proud of the fact that officers showed up. They stood that line and they protected the people of Columbus the best they can. You know, there's critiques and criticisms about the body camera. You know, that's a technology thing. The batteries on those don't last 16 hours. Detectives that were out wearing riot gear working this do not have body cameras. So that's something moving forward. We have to decide how much we want to invest in that. And that's the reason I'm putting this team together, that there'll be a smaller group of people, specially trained to engage in this conduct and in these protest activities and First Amendment protected activities that are properly equipped with the right riot gear or personal protective gear, I'll say, to be in these situations, to keep themselves safe, but also have body cameras on. And again, keep in mind, regardless of body cameras, everyone out there had phones. There was surveillance from every building out there, the helicopters overhead with surveillance. There was a lot of video out there. So I don't think that was a complete failure of our body camera program. As Jenny and Mark had mentioned, many times when those cameras are available, that is very good evidence for the officers, and that probably cleared a lot of officers, as well as left some doubt as to who people were, but it also cleared a lot of officers.
No, I know you guys did a video. You posted a video because some people had concerns about some of the name badges were taken off and stuff. But from what I remember being down there, they had the tape of their badge numbers either on the front of the riot gear or on the back of their helmets. Were officers told to have the badge number on them at all times during the protest, or when did that happen if it wasn't at the start?
Yeah, so in about 2 years ago, we actually took this wide reflective tape and put on the back of every helmet with the officers' badge numbers. That was already there, but that was for the supervisors behind to be able to know who to call out to what's going on. What the problem was is there was nothing forward-facing where people were filming to capture that badge number. So what we did during the conversation with the mayor and city council was we agreed to put duct tape basically on the front of the uniforms and put badge numbers on there so it would be more readily apparent. And that was one of the examples where we did improve in progress.
We'll stick around for any additional questions or one-on-ones. Thanks, everybody.